All right, welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and start. Dan Aldridge has been going through a process in his search for truth. He was very involved in the Obama election and became what you would say a political animal. Through this process, he started to see cracks in the structure of belief for these ideologies and dogmas in politics. This opened the way for his studies into skepticism. The title of his speech tonight is Skepticism, Pseudo-Science, and Scientific Denialism. So, welcome, Dan. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. First of all, I'd like to point out, it just occurred to me today, the irony of the fact that I'm doing a lecture on skepticism on Easter Sunday. Okay, anyway, I'd like to begin with a short little disclaimer. This topic can be kind of challenging for people because when they hear the word skeptic or skepticism, they tend to get the feeling that maybe they're being laughed at. Because perhaps they have a belief which is unconventional or maybe isn't supported by science. But I have some news for you. Everybody has their sacred cow or sacred cows, and that includes me. And this is why I'm not here to step on anybody's toes or convince anybody not to believe in anything. What I am here to tell you is what skepticism is and why I think you should love it, regardless of what you believe. To paraphrase Richard Dawkins, we are all atheists for about 99% of the gods ever worshipped by humanity. And I'm not here to promote atheism. I'm also not here to promote any religion. But I think we can see a parallel there with skepticism. Because basically we are all skeptical about 99% of the things which other humans believe. And for example, we are all probably skeptical that you can smoke vulture meat to gain knowledge of the future, which, for example, certain people in Africa believe. We're also probably skeptical of the fact that humans are ever abducted by fairies, which was in fact believed by a majority of people in Europe for hundreds of years. Although maybe nowadays some of us are not skeptical of the fact that humans are abducted by aliens. Others of us are. We are probably also all skeptical about the claim that the world is flat. And we're probably all skeptical about the practice of binding little girls' feet to make them stay 5 inches long for the rest of their lives. Although at a time in history, certain people believed that this was a good thing to do for various reasons. There's one time I can guarantee you when we're all skeptical, which is when someone's trying to pry your hard-earned money out of your wallet. At that time, our skeptical force fields all come up. There's another time we should all be skeptical. That's when somebody's trying to get us to go home with them. If you're not skeptical at such times, I suggest you read this, which is a book called The Game that teaches men or women how to use cold reading techniques, which is what fortune telling is based on, to pick up people for sexual encounters. And I recommend. It sounds suspect that I own this book, but I honestly, as a skeptic, I strongly recommend everybody read it, especially women, so that you know the tricks of the trade. So I'd like you all to imagine a college lecture hall, perhaps something like this, a bit bigger, maybe with about 50 college students in attendance. And the professor tells the students the following: students, I have provided a renowned astrologer with your names, your date of birth, the time of birth, your place of birth, under a guarantee of privacy, of course, and he has done a personal reading for each and every one of you. Okay? And then the professor points to an elderly gentleman standing in the corner. He kind of looks like Santa Claus. And that man proceeds to hand out a personal reading to each student, after finding out their names, of course. And each page has at the top the student's name, their place of birth, their date of birth, and then a short astrological reading, basically describing their personality. Okay? So the students look over the reading, and then the elderly gentleman surveys them about the results. So he says, students, I'd like you to close your eyes and raise your hands if you feel that the reading I have done for you is mostly or completely wrong. Maybe a few hands go up. He says, okay, open your eyes. And then he says, okay, now, everybody takes a look around. Now close your eyes again. And this time, I want to hear how many people think, maybe 50% right, 50% wrong. And again, a couple hands go up. Open your eyes. Okay, look around. We see the results. Okay, now, close your eyes again. How many people think it was mostly correct or almost absolutely correct? All the rest of the hands go up. Pretty amazing result for this astrologer. So the professor says, well, let's have a round of applause for our astrologer. Everybody, hey, right? He's quite the man. Then the astrologer says, okay, students, now I would like you to take that reading that I have done for you, and I would like you to exchange it with somebody sitting next to you or near you. There's a rustling of papers, and suddenly a burst of laughter. I think you can all anticipate the punchline. Every reading in that room of 50 students was exactly the same. And not only was it exactly the same, it's sitting right there in front of you. It's the first page of the package I've given you. And I've actually done this to people by putting their name and date of birth at the top. I had it. I wanted to do it tonight, but I figured it would take too much time and I wasn't sure how to get everyone's names. Once you know the gimmick, it won't work anyway. So I basically spoiled it for you. But the question is, how can it be? How can that be possible? Are people so easily fooled, so gullible? And the short answer is, yes, they are. But the point is, it is not our fault. And this is why skeptics are not laughing at you, or me, or anybody. The truth we know from evolutionary biology is that human minds are hardwired for bias. If you don't believe me, think about the full moon for a minute. What comes to mind? Generally, a face. If you think about the stars, what comes to mind? Astrological constellations. But why? I assure you there is no face on the moon. Okay, and the shapes that we see in the stars actually are not definitive. They vary from one culture to another. So what is going on there? And here we need to get a little bit technical. Basically, there's no evolutionary benefit to being aware of randomness or lack of connection. If one of your ape-like hominid ancestors were to hear rustling in the trees, you could basically guess one of two things. A, it's probably just the wind. Or B, maybe it's a predator. Now, if you guess wind and it turns out to be the wind, really you've gained nothing. There's no benefit to knowing that. But if you guess wind and it turns out to be a predator, well, you're not going to leave any offspring, are you? And therefore, that trait is not going to be, the trait of guessing wind is not going to be passed down. The point is whether there's a predator in the bushes or not, it is of greater benefit for our brains to assume there is a predator when our ears hear rustling in the bushes. And that is what we can call a simple pattern association. What this means for the bigger picture is that we are designed, and I use this word very figuratively, to find patterns. This is great when it entails recognizing patterns that lead to food, or lead to drinkable water, or lead to reproduction. But The problem is our brains have become so good at recognizing patterns that not all the patterns we find are actually there. Hence, the face we see on the moon, the shapes we see in the stars, and a whole lot of other stuff that all those other people believe. So back to the astrology reading. The question as to why a classroom full of 50 students, bright college kids, can be fooled like this is because we are not designed to look for randomness. We are defined to look for a pattern. Okay, so imagine your brain when you're reading that blurb. It's basically like this. Miss, 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 hit. Miss, miss, hit. Miss, miss, hit. Miss, miss, hit. You're ignoring the misses. You're focusing on the hits. When you see the hit, your brain lights up. And then what your brain does, because that's what it's programmed to do, is you draw the lines, you connect the dots. And this is how so many students can see a pattern in randomness. Okay, this is why, for example, fortune telling works. This is why a lot of things that perhaps actually don't work seem to work. And this is why we need to be careful. Think about the X-Files. I want to believe. This is the default position of the human mind. So now I'm going to get to the definition of skepticism. To quote the Princess Bride, do you remember Inigo Montoya? You keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means. Skeptic is derived from the word skeptikos, which means inquiring or to look around. It does not mean cynicism. Cynics are distrustful of any advice or information that does not agree with what they already think. They do not accept claims that challenge their belief system. Skeptics are open-minded and try to eliminate personal biases, partly for the reasons which I've just told you guys. Cynics basically hold negative views and are not open to evidence that refutes their beliefs. Cynicism often leads to dogmatism, and dogmatism is the opposite of what skepticism preaches. In fact, many beliefs that purport to be skeptical, such as the notion that there is a vast medical conspiracy that actively suppresses a cure for cancer, this view is actually highly cynical, but it is not skeptical. Skepticism also doesn't mean saying no simply for the sake of saying no, or knee-jerk rejection of authority or expertise. Most skeptics will tell you the main premise of skepticism is to hold one's beliefs in proportion to the available evidence. However, this isn't where I like to start when I talk about skepticism, for the reasons that I just pointed out previously. I think these days, thanks to the internet, believe me, you can find evidence that supports anything you are predisposed to believe. This is in fact a big part of the problem. There is a huge human tendency, which skeptics call confirmation bias. Okay, and confirmation bias means that we tend to remember evidence that supports what we already believe. And we tend to ignore or forget evidence that disconfirms what we believe. If you don't believe me, let me ask you, how come women always tend to remember that men always leave the toilet seat up, but men always tend to remember leaving it down? They cannot possibly both be right. Another less spurious example would be, think about the belief, everybody has this belief. I have it too. Think about the belief that you can sense when other people are watching you in a crowd. Everybody believes that. I believe it. But has anybody ever tested it? Actually, science has tested it. It's a testable claim. And according to science, it's false. Your likelihood of doing that is extremely low. So why do we believe it? It's because the few times it actually happens, like I'm sitting here at a party and there's an attractive woman looking at me. It makes a strong impression. But all the times that I'm sitting there at a party and somebody's looking at me and I don't notice it, it makes no impression at all, of course, because I'm not noticing it. Okay, and I can give you countless examples from my own life about this. Okay, same goes for dreams. When we think that perhaps we had a dream that predicted the future, and I know we've all had this experience, but we need to remember that our dreams are never about a single topic. They tend to ramble. They tend to cover a lot of topics. But on the occasional occurrence that something we dream about seems to predict something that actually happens, we ignore or we forget everything else in the dream that had nothing to do with what actually happened. Let alone all the other dreams we had that didn't predict anything at all. And then we go and tell everybody we have psychic powers. Okay? And it's not our fault because our brains are hooked up that way. Okay? So, in my opinion, the starting point of skepticism is to start at home by being skeptical of numero uno. This means I tell myself, I remind myself constantly, I will be aware of the human tendency to recognize false patterns, as I've described above. I will be aware that humans have a piss-poor memory that can be highly selective, as I've just described about the dreams. I will be aware that human minds are not designed to comprehend large numbers or statistics. I will be aware that there is a huge accumulated body of knowledge, and I really can't know much about it outside my own very small area of expertise. Okay, so therefore, the reason I'm reminding myself all these things is the thing I should be first and foremost skeptical of is me, my own brain. In other words, don't believe everything you think. Okay? You see, people highly overestimate their ability to know much. They think that their own personal anecdotes or the experience of a few friends means more than the accumulated knowledge of hundreds of years of science. The problem with anecdotes is that they are like experiments, except they're conducted without any sort of bias controls, with a sample size of 1, which is utterly statistically insignificant, with no requirements for repeatability, and in other words, in scientific terms, they're practically useless. People often say something like, hey, don't knock it till you try it. But trying it myself is not the way to validate a claim. As I've told you before, we are hardwired to find whatever it is we're looking for. To quote the astrologer that I described to you before, the man who looked like Santa Claus, his name is James Randi, and he's a master magician and a master skeptic. And basically, what he says about magic is the main point of magic is to remind us how meaningless the sentence, I've seen it with my own eyes, is. On top of that, we put a lot of faith in this thing called common sense. To quote Einstein, common sense is the collection of prejudices acquired by the age of 18. Let me ask you something. I don't know exactly how many people there are here, but let's say there were 23 people attending this lecture today, which actually not that far off. But anyway, what would be the odds of 2 people sitting here sharing the same birthday? Any guesses?
Not good.
23.
Sorry?
That's almost impossible. 17 to 1.
Okay, those guesses are normal.
That's like impossible.
I hate to tell you, actually, it's greater than 50%. It's just over 50%. I can't. I know. I realize this makes absolutely no sense, but that's the point. Genuine knowledge is not patently obvious. And honestly, you can find the math on the internet. But when we think that knowledge is patently obvious, it gets us into trouble. For example, common sense will allow us to deduct that the sun goes around the earth. I mean, after all, it goes down over there, it comes up over there. I mean, how easy can that be? In financial terms, common sense will lead us to do really silly things, like throwing good money after bad. In other words, we make a bad investment, but we become biased towards that investment, even though the money is already gone. And so we continue to dump money down the money hole when we should actually just cut our losses and let it go. Another common example of common sense would be, oh, well, global warming isn't real. Look, it's snowing here in Wisconsin in January. Okay, this is an example of anecdotal evidence trumping empirical evidence. There are countless other examples of knowledge gleaned by science that are totally counterintuitive. For example, light is both a particle and a wave. Water vapor is lighter than air. How can that be? The universe is unimaginably huge. You and I, we are, and I'm very sorry, we have a common descendant with the cockroach. Okay, this is not something that is easy to imagine. Nevertheless, it is true. And one more thing that is incredibly difficult to imagine, this table is made up mostly of empty space. And you are not actually touching the chair you are sitting on. Those things, they are not patently obvious. They're nevertheless true. Obviously, I could go on at length. I could take up an hour giving you examples like that. But I hope I've convinced you that what we really need first and foremost when trying to be skeptical is a heavy dose of humility. This means, for one thing, that when we want to believe something, there's all the more reason that it should require more evidence and not less to convince us. I would love to believe that there are aliens visiting the earth and somehow manipulating my life. Therefore, I should be all the more skeptical. If we begin with this premise, the rest of it becomes much easier. Okay, another primary tenet of skepticism, as I said before, is to try to hold your beliefs as closely as possible in proportion to the best available evidence. Now notice that I said the best available evidence. Okay, because as I mentioned before, on the internet you can find evidence, quote-unquote evidence for anything. Okay, however, that evidence might not be good. You need to check it and double check it and triple check it. You need to find out, is the source who is saying this considered an expert by other experts in the field? Do they have credibility? Have other experts in the field tested this claim, and do they agree with it? And so on. Some people believe that demanding convincing evidence is a sign of being closed-minded. However, willingness to consider ideas unconditionally is absolutely not required for open-mindedness. Think of it this way. If my claim requires suspension of your critical thinking, it's probably not you who needs less evidence. It's me who needs more. Okay, and notice that saying, I don't believe X, is not the same as claiming X cannot be true. In science and in skepticism, all beliefs should be tentative. However, the skeptical mind should remember that the burden of proof falls on the person making the claim. In this way, I like to say that skepticism is like a bug screen. Okay? Bugs are notoriously hard to get out of your house once they come in and set up shop. The same is true for false beliefs. Once they begin to lodge themselves, they become like the premises for everything that follows. It is true that skepticism occasionally causes us to reject beliefs that are true when we are trying to screen out beliefs that are false. However, if we stick to the tenet that we should hold our beliefs in proportion to the evidence, if evidence accumulates sufficiently, then we should be willing to change our minds. Okay, and I can give you an example of that would be, there's a guy named Michael Shermer who used to be highly skeptical of the claim that global warming is true. The reason he was skeptical was, quite frankly, he was a libertarian and he had a bias. However, Michael Shermer was also a skeptic. And as the evidence just continued to accumulate and accumulate, and more of a scientific consensus began to build, Michael Shermer finally said, damn it, I love libertarianism, I love the free market, but I've got to follow the evidence. And he gave it up. He came out, he publicly rejected what he had been saying previously and admitted the reality of global warming. Okay, sorry, it looks like I'm going to have to kind of jump here quickly. I also wanted to talk about pseudoscience and scientific denialism, but I'm just going to hit them really quickly. Okay, pseudoscience can basically be described as a set of beliefs which knows that science is how we get validity in the world. And so pseudoscience tries to sort of ride on science's coattails by imitating science. Okay, but pseudoscience has a few qualities that distinguish it very clearly from science. Okay, and the most important of these is the fact that pseudoscience is dogmatic. What do we mean by dogmatic? It begins with its conclusion and sets out to prove the conclusion instead of beginning with a hypothesis and attempting to falsify the hypothesis, which is what good science does. For this reason, pseudoscience has to employ all sorts of strategies to defend its claims when it is actually scrutinized by science. Okay, and some of the qualities that you tend to see in pseudoscience would be, for example, appeal to ancient knowledge. Okay, the idea that, oh, well, this has been around for a long time, therefore it must be true. Okay, why this is wrong should hardly require explanation, except that we all believe it. I'd need about another half an hour to list all of the crazy, I shouldn't say crazy, but baseless beliefs that human beings have had in our long history. Okay, but the fact is, in fact, many very good theories are not very old at all. Because they've been replaced, because they have replaced older theories. Generally, the most recent theory, the more recent the evidence, the better scientific foundation it has. Okay? Another common appeal we will hear in pseudoscience is an appeal to popularity. In other words, oh, a lot of people believe this, therefore it must be true. Okay? This does not guarantee anything. And with everything that I've told you about the human tendency for bias, we should already know why this is wrong. The philosopher Bertrand Russell said, the fact that an opinion has been widely held is no evidence that it is not utterly absurd. Indeed, in view of the silliness of the majority of mankind, a widespread belief is more likely to be foolish than sensible. Please note, though, this does not mean that a consensus of experts in a field is irrelevant. Okay, because this is another claim that we often hear from pseudoscience and science denialism. I'm not going to go into all the other strategies of pseudoscience because I need to wrap it up. But I did want to just quickly explain the difference between pseudoscience and science denialism. Okay? Science denialism is very similar to pseudoscience in its strategies, but the purpose is a little different. Basically, pseudoscience is about putting on the trappings of science to establish a proposition, whereas denialism is about attacking or undermining established science. Examples of scientific denialism would be, for example, the denial that the HIV virus exists, or that there is a causal relationship between HIV and AIDS. Another very important example, which I've mentioned several times tonight, is the denial that global warming is occurring, or that it is caused by human activities. A third one that we've all encountered timeless times is the denial that all living things have a common ancestor via the process of evolution through natural selection. And the strategies that science denialism tends to use will be appeals to a conspiracy or a vast suppression of knowledge. Okay? The problem with conspiracy theories is that they are by definition secret. If there's a vast secret collusion of the powers that be, well, that's fine, but you have to be able to prove it. You can't simply say, oh, well, we don't have the evidence because it's being suppressed. What's the problem with this? This claim is unfalsifiable. It's like a force field against falsifiability, because anytime somebody pulls evidence on you, you just say, oh, that proves the conspiracy. That just shows you how deep it goes. So it's an unfalsifiable claim, and unfalsifiable claims are unscientific. Another thing which scientific denial tends to do is to use extreme selectivity, or what we call cherry picking, in selecting its data. Okay, so in other words, they'll sift through a whole lot of information to find the few relatively kind of rogue sources that confirm what they want you to think. Another thing that they do is what we call moving goalposts. In other words, every time someone tries to prove that their claim is wrong, they just say, oh, well, actually, we didn't really mean that, we meant this. Okay, this is one we often see with evolution denial. Okay, or as I mentioned before with HIV denial, HIV deniers used to say, oh, scientists have never micrographed the virus. Okay? Eventually, science went and micrographed the HIV virus. Not only did they micrograph it, they took pictures of it, they took video of it. Okay? But once that happened, the HIV deniers just moved their goalposts. They just made some, what we call, the term is evading me right now. Special pleading. They do special pleading. They make excuses instead of modifying their hypothesis. Okay, and making excuses or screaming conspiracy are not the marks of science. You don't hear good scientists doing this. And when you're trying to think skeptically, if you hear claims like that, red flags should be popping up. Okay, in summary, I just wanted to quote a few of my favorite thinkers for you. This is from Carl Sagan. You could go to a magician or a witch doctor to predict the sex of your child, in which case the likelihood of accuracy is about 1 out of 2. Or you could ask a scientist, in which case it will be about 99 times out of 100. You could ask an astrologer to predict the next solar eclipse, Or you could ask a scientist. You could pray to protect your child from polio, or you could give them a polio vaccine. The second one is from Dr. Stephen Novella, who is the host of The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, which is my favorite podcast. Questioning our own motives and our own process is critical to skepticism and the scientific outlook. We must realize the default mode of human psychology is to grab onto comforting beliefs for purely emotional reasons, and then justify those beliefs to ourselves with post hoc rationalizations. History is strewn with ideas that seemed intuitive and made sense at the time, but were hopelessly wrong. There is nothing magical about science. It is simply a systematic way for carefully and thoroughly observing nature and using consistent logic to evaluate the results. So which part of that exactly do you disagree with? Do you disagree with being thorough, using careful observations, being systematic, or using consistent logic? And finally, this is from Robert G. Ingersoll from the 19th century. I admit that reason is a small and feeble flame, a flickering torch by stumblers carried in the starless night, blown and flared by passion's storm. And yet it is the only light. Extinguish that, and naught remains. Okay, so that's